My wife died on a luxury cruise 9 years ago, and I spent the next decade paying her parents for my supposed failure. On a business trip to Italy, I walked into a café and saw a woman identical to her laughing with a new husband and 3 children. I followed them, and the absolute shock of the truth destroyed my entire reality. My name is Gerald. I am 70 years old, and I am an architect who built an empire from nothing. Before I tell you how I tore my treacherous family down to the studs, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal should always be met with absolute justice. The marble island in my kitchen felt like a hostile negotiation table. Harold and Evelyn sat across from me, their expensive designer clothes stark against the morning light. They never visited to check on my health. Harold slid a bank transfer form across the cold granite surface. He demanded their $10,000 monthly allowance to maintain their exclusive country club membership and their pristine lifestyle. I poured my black coffee and stared at the printed numbers. Evelyn weaponized her tears, instantly executing a performance she had perfected over nearly a decade. She reminded me that Valerie, their precious daughter, fell off a cruise ship balcony 9 years ago under my watch. She leaned forward and stated it was my fundamental duty to compensate them for the child I failed to protect. For 9 years, that fabricated guilt had been a heavy chain around my neck. I built my commercial architectural firm from the ground up, navigating decades of brutal systemic barriers as an African-American man, only to have my hard-earned wealth siphoned by my late wife's entitled parents. They viewed my grief as a lucrative business model. I picked up my gold pen. I did not argue. Arguing with them only resulted in louder accusations and more dramatic tears. I signed the transfer authorization in complete silence. Harold snatched the paper eagerly, his calculated grief vanishing the exact moment the ink dried. They treated my home like a bank lobby. Harold adjusted his silk tie and warned me not to be late with next month's payment. He threatened to go to the press and drag my firm's reputation through the mud by claiming I abandoned my grieving in-laws. The extortion was constant and exhausting. I watched their luxury car pull out of my driveway, taking another piece of my dignity with them. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the familiar hollow ache of exploitation in my chest. The quiet of the empty kitchen lasted less than 2 minutes. That brief peace was immediately interrupted by the sound of the front door slamming open. Naomi and her husband Bradley marched into the kitchen without knocking. Bradley carried a thick leather folder and an air of unearned arrogance. He violently slammed a commercial loan contract onto the table, rattling my coffee cup and spilling hot liquid across the granite. He demanded I co-sign the document immediately. His tech startup was bleeding capital, and he needed my architectural firm as collateral to secure a massive bridge loan. I looked at Naomi. My daughter refused to meet my eyes. She stared intently at the floor, playing nervously with her diamond rings. I wiped up the spilled coffee and told Bradley my firm was my legacy, not a gambling chip for his failed ventures. I had spent 40 years designing city skylines, and I refused to risk my employees' livelihoods for his incompetence. Bradley leaned over the table, his face flushed red with aggressive entitlement. He slammed his fist down and threatened that if I did not sign the contract, he would sever my relationship with Naomi completely. He stated I would die a lonely, bitter old man in a massive, empty house, forbidden from ever seeing my own daughter again. The emotional extortion was perfectly executed. He knew Naomi was the only family I had left after Valerie's death. I looked at the daughter I raised, hoping she would defend me or intervene. She remained absolutely silent, fully complicit in her husband's blackmail. The betrayal stung worse than the threat itself. I picked up the same gold pen I used for her grandparents. I signed the collateral agreement, trading my financial security for the illusion of a family connection. Bradley snatched the folder with a triumphant smirk, checking the signature to ensure it was valid. He grabbed Naomi by the arm and guided her out of the kitchen, entirely ignoring my presence. I stood up, abandoning my cold coffee. I walked to my master bedroom and packed my suitcase with dark suits and dress shirts. I had a keynote presentation, at an international architectural symposium in Milan, Italy. I desperately needed to escape the suffocating walls of my own home and the parasites living off my grief. The flight leaves in 3 hours. The distance across the Atlantic Ocean felt like the only way to breathe clean air again. I walked down the hallway to my private study to retrieve my passport from the desk drawer. I stopped just outside the heavy oak doors. Bradley and Naomi were inside. They stood directly over my concealed floor safe. I held my breath, pressed my back against the wall, and listened. Bradley whispered frantically, assuring Naomi they only needed 2 more weeks to drain the primary accounts completely. He stated they would liquidate the firm's assets, finalize the secondary mortgages, and disappear before I ever realized the money was gone. Naomi agreed with terrifying coldness, telling him to hurry the transfers before I returned from Europe. She called me a clueless old man who deserved to lose everything. I did not barge into the room. I did not scream or demand an explanation. A cold, mechanical clarity washed over my mind instantly, freezing any remaining paternal affection. I stepped back silently, grabbed a spare passport from my hidden travel bag in the coat closet, and walked out the back door into the humid Atlanta morning. I ordered a taxi to the airport, with a mind entirely focused on survival. I boarded my flight to Italy knowing my home was a hostasio, war zone. I landed in Milan and took a private car straight to the city center. I needed a moment of peace and a strong coffee before the symposium began. I walked into a high-end café near the majestic Duomo. A waiter handed me a hot espresso in a tiny ceramic cup. I turned toward the crowded seating area to find a table. A woman laughed loudly at a corner table bathed in sunlight. The specific pitch of that sound paralyzed my lungs. I knew that laugh. I had heard it every day for 30 years. She turned her head toward the natural light to call for a waiter. My hand opened. I dropped my espresso cup. The hot liquid shattered the ceramic and splashed across my polished leather shoes. Sitting at the table wearing expensive designer sunglasses and drinking wine was Valerie. My dead wife was completely alive. She looked exactly the same as she did 9 years ago, devoid of any aging or stress. The entire tragedy of the cruise ship was a fabricated lie. The grief that consumed my life was a calculated stage play. I stood frozen behind a thick marble pillar in the center of the bustling café. The rich scent of roasted espresso beans turned to ash in my mouth. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands possessed the steady, terrifying calm of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. I pressed record. The camera lens bypassed the busy waiters and locked onto the sunlit corner table. There sat Valerie. Her dark hair was styled differently, cut sharply at the shoulders, and her laughter carried a practiced European elegance. But the distinct curve of her jawline and the familiar rhythm of her hand gestures shattered any illusion of a mistake. She was not a ghost. She was a master architect of deception. Next to her sat an older man in a bespoke linen suit. He radiated the casual arrogance of generational wealth. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. Valerie smiled affectionately, brushing his silver hair back into place. Then the true devastation materialized. 3 boys sat across from the couple. They shared Valerie's unmistakable deep brown eyes and her exact smile. They wore matching private school blazers, arguing playfully over a plate of pastries. They were identical triplets. I watched the boys laugh as Valerie wiped powdered sugar from one of their chins. My mind, trained for 40 years to calculate structural loads and precise dimensions, instantly performed the most horrific arithmetic of my life. The Coast Guard suspended the search for Valerie's body exactly 9 years and 2 months ago. I paid for a closed casket memorial while heavily medicated on grief. These boys were unequivocally 8 years old. The timeline locked into place like the steel vault of a prison cell. She did not slip over the balcony railing during a midnight squall. She climbed down onto a waiting vessel. She was actively pregnant with another man's children while occupying my cabin, spending my money, and looking me directly in the eye. The grand maritime tragedy was nothing but a meticulously funded extraction protocol. I tapped the red button on my screen. The video file saved securely to my encrypted cloud. I did not storm the table. A public spectacle would only give a seasoned liar the immediate advantage. I required absolute leverage. I waited in the cold shadow of the marble pillar, tracking my deceased wife as she played the role of a perfect matriarch. The wealthy Italian man eventually stood up, checking a heavy platinum watch. He kissed Valerie's forehead, gathered the three boys, and pointed toward a sleek black car idling near the piazza. Valerie waved them off, adjusting her thick cashmere coat. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, heading toward the high-end designer boutiques lining the narrow cobblestone street. I stepped out from the shadow of the pillar. I followed the phantom. I tracked her silently for 3 long blocks. She navigated the crowds with the confident, entitled stride of a woman who firmly believed she had outsmarted the entire universe. She took a sharp left turn down a narrow shaded alleyway flanked by towering 16th-century brick walls, heading toward the private rear entrance of a luxury boutique. I quickened my pace. The heavy rubber soles of my shoes echoed sharply against the damp stone. She paused, clearly irritated by the approaching footsteps, and turned around with a scowl. The annoyance on her flawless face instantly dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror. Her manicured hands lost all strength. 4 glossy shopping bags crashed onto the wet cobblestones. Expensive designer boxes spilled open their silk contents, dragging in the dirty water of the gutter. We stood exactly 6 feet apart in the cold shadows. She did not scream. She did not collapse. The initial shock vanished from her eyes in less than 5 seconds, entirely replaced by a hardened, calculating glare. There were no desperate tears of guilt. There was no frantic apology for the decade of manufactured hell she had subjected me to. She looked at me with the cold, sterile annoyance of a corporate executive facing an unexpected audit. She demanded to know what I was doing in Milan. I told her I was attending a symposium completely by chance. I told her the universe had finally decided to balance the ledger. Valerie scoffed, stepping away from her ruined merchandise. She immediately pivoted into a defensive, aggressive negotiation. She stated her new husband was a deeply connected maritime shipping magnate. She coldly explained she required a life I could never provide, demanding elite European society rather than the quiet, predictable suburban existence we had built in Atlanta. I stared at the woman I had once sworn to protect until my dying breath. The absolute absence of basic human empathy in her voice physically disgusted me. I asked her about the 9 years of ongoing extortion. I asked her about Gerald and Evelyn draining my bank accounts every single month, while aggressively weeping over her empty grave. Valerie crossed her arms, entirely unfazed by my disgust. She bluntly offered to buy my silence on the spot. She reached into her coat, pulled out a thick leather checkbook, and promised to wire $2 million directly into my private account by midnight. All I had to do was turn around, walk back to the airport, and continue playing the role of the grieving widower. She framed the massive bribe as a generous severance package for my past services. She commanded me to take the cash and enjoy my pathetic retirement. I looked at the checkbook, then directly into her reconstructed face. The audacity was staggering. She truly believed her stolen wealth could easily purchase my remaining dignity. I did not blink. I told her $2 million was an embarrassingly low price for a man's soul. I rejected her bribe with a tone of absolute terrifying finality. Valerie's arrogant composure shattered instantly. Her face flushed dark red with sudden violent rage. She stepped forward, pointing a sharp, trembling finger directly at my chest. She warned me that if I went to the American authorities, I would not just destroy her beautiful new empire. She swore I would completely annihilate my own daughter's life. I froze. The air in the alley grew significantly colder. I demanded to know what Naomi had to do with this maritime fraud. Valerie unleashed a cruel, triumphant laugh that echoed off the brick walls. She called me a blind, pathetic old fool. She explicitly stated that Bradley was the mastermind behind the entire financial structure. She viciously bragged that my white son-in-law personally handled every single offshore wire transfer that kept her hidden and funded in Italy. The horrific truth slammed into my chest like a runaway freight train. Gerald and Evelyn were not merely extorting me out of prolonged grief. Bradley and Naomi were not just casually bleeding my firm to fund a startup. The entire family had completely orchestrated the fake death on the cruise ship together. They actively staged the tragedy to legally claim my massive $4 million life insurance policy. Bradley expertly laundered the death benefit. Naomi covered the digital tracks. Her parents played the aggressively grieving victims to extract my personal wealth as an ongoing bonus. My family did not simply hate me, they viewed me as a designated financial mark. Valerie smiled viciously, assuming her threat had successfully paralyzed me. She ordered me to fly back to Atlanta and keep writing the monthly checks if I wanted my only daughter to stay out of a federal penitentiary. She turned on her heel and walked briskly out of the alley. I stood alone in the damp shadows, letting her walk away. The heavy sorrow I had carried for 9 years evaporated entirely. It was instantly replaced by a cold, systematic desire for total, unmerciful annihilation. I pulled out my phone and booked the next direct flight back to Atlanta. I booked the first direct flight from Milan to Atlanta. The 10 hours across the Atlantic provided ample time to lock my fatherly grief inside a steel vault and replace it with absolute unforgiving calculus. I spent 40 years navigating the brutal racial politics of the Southern corporate world to build my architectural firm into an empire. I survived ruthless competitors and hostile economic downturns. I would easily survive my own treacherous family. I bypassed my usual luxury car service and took a standard taxi from Hartsfield-Jackson to ensure my arrival remained entirely unannounced. I walked up the bluestone driveway of my Buckhead estate a full 24 hours ahead of my scheduled return. The heavy mahogany front doors stood wide open, inviting the damp Georgia heat inside. A valet I did not hire rushed forward to take my luggage. I ignored him and stepped into the marble foyer. The pulsing bass of a live jazz quartet echoed from the grand living room. I walked quietly down the hall. A private catering staff navigated my custom kitchen carrying silver trays of caviar and imported truffles. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked my banking notifications. My primary black credit card had just sustained a $15,000 charge to a luxury event planning service. I stood in the shadow of the arched doorway and observed the parasites infesting my home. Naomi wore a new diamond necklace, laughing effortlessly with a group of socialites I did not recognize. Gerald and Evelyn occupied the center leather sofas like reigning monarchs. Evelyn held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, her wrists heavy with gold bracelets. I listened closely as Gerald spoke loudly over the music. He bragged to an impressed guest about the limitless generosity of his grieving son-in-law. Gerald laughed deeply, calling me a pathetic old workaholic who still cried over an empty ocean grave. He declared my wealth was finally being put to proper use by the people who truly deserved it. The sheer audacity of the scene solidified my absolute resolve. They were throwing a lavish victory party funded by the very man they had completely destroyed. I did not storm into the room to shatter their glasses. I did not flip the catering tables or demand the guests leave my property. I required them to believe their grand illusion remained entirely intact. I took a deep breath, adjusted the lapels of my tailored suit, and walked directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandelier. The music seemed to halt the exact second Naomi spotted me. The color instantly drained from her flawless face. Her champagne glass rattled against the side table as she hurriedly set it down. Gerald choked on his laughter, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. Evelyn froze with her drink halfway to her mouth. I stretched my mouth into a wide, terrifyingly calm smile. I walked toward my daughter with my arms open wide. I hugged her stiff, trembling body and kissed her cheek. I told her the architectural symposium in Milan was incredibly boring and I decided to come home early to surprise my beloved family. Naomi, the daughter I had shielded from every hardship, the girl who cried on my shoulder when her mother supposedly drowned, stammered a frantic greeting. She attempted to physically block my view of the catering staff and the lavish floral arrangements. I patted Gerald firmly on the shoulder and told him to enjoy the expensive champagne on my dime. I insisted they continue the grand celebration without any guilt. Bradley suddenly emerged from the west hallway. His face went entirely pale when he saw me standing in the center of the living room. I watched his hand dart instinctively to the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He was desperately trying to conceal a small, glowing bank security token. It was a digital device designed exclusively for authorizing massive corporate wire transfers. He stepped forward and awkwardly offered his hand. I shook it firmly, squeezing his fingers just a fraction too tight to let him feel my physical strength. I asked him cheerfully if his new tech startup was finally turning a profit. Bradley swallowed hard, offering a weak nod and a fabricated update about incoming foreign investors. His pupils were dilated with sheer panic. He knew he was standing in the home of the man he was actively robbing. I maintained my bright, ignorant facade perfectly. I told Bradley I needed a moment to unpack and wash off the deep exhaustion of the international flight. I excused myself from the party, turning my back on the 4 people who had orchestrated the darkest tragedy of my life. I walked down the long corridor toward my private study, leaving the silent, terrified room behind me. Every step I took away from them felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. I knew they were currently exchanging terrified glances in the living room, wondering if I suspected anything. Let them sweat. The real execution would require precise preparation. I locked the heavy oak door of my study behind me. The sound of the jazz band became a distant, muffled hum. I walked directly to the Persian rug near my mahogany desk and rolled it back to reveal the concealed floor safe. I entered the numeric combination. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. I reached inside to retrieve my master financial ledger. I immediately noticed the absolute violation of my private sanctuary. The thick manila envelope containing the $4 million life insurance payout documents from Valerie's supposed death 9 years ago was entirely missing. I searched the remaining compartments with surgical precision. The official death certificate, the International Maritime Investigation reports, and the original beneficiary designations had all been removed. They were meticulously erasing the paper trail of their original crime. I reached into the back of the safe, and my fingers brushed against a crisp, unfamiliar stack of heavy legal paper. I pulled the document into the light of my desk lamp. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Durable Power of Attorney for Healthcare and Financial Management." I scanned the dense legal text. The document was freshly drafted by a ruthless downtown law firm known for hostile corporate takeovers. It named Bradley as my sole legal guardian. The clauses explicitly granted my white son-in-law absolute control over my architectural firm, my massive real estate holdings, and all my liquid assets. The trigger for this total transfer of power was explicitly defined as my medical incapacitation or severe cognitive decline. The document was a loaded weapon pointed directly at my mind. The pieces of their deadly puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Naomi and Bradley were not just stealing my money in secret. They were actively constructing a legal mechanism to erase my autonomy completely. They intended to declare me mentally unfit, strip me of my lifetime legacy, and hand the keys of my empire directly to the man who was currently funding Valerie's luxurious new life in Italy. They viewed my 70 years of hard work as an inheritance to be forcefully seized. I folded the fraudulent document and placed it inside my jacket pocket. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of legal destruction. They had no idea they had just invited a master architect to design their absolute downfall. I drove straight from my compromised estate to a sterile, windowless rented office space in an industrial park on the outskirts of Atlanta. I trusted the network security at my own architectural firm exactly 0%. I had summoned Elliot. We met 20 years ago when he brutally audited a massive municipal project I designed. He was a ruthless former federal auditor, with a mind like a steel trap and an absolute disregard for social pleasantries. He arrived carrying nothing but a heavily encrypted laptop. I placed my device on the metal table and slid the freshly drafted power of attorney document across the surface. I pressed play on the video I captured in Milan. Elliot watched Valerie laugh with her Italian husband and her triplets. He did not express any shock. He merely adjusted his glasses and opened his terminal. I explained the situation with cold, mathematical precision. My entire family faked my wife's death 9 years ago, claimed a massive life insurance payout, and drafted fraudulent legal paperwork to declare me mentally unfit to seize my architectural empire. Elliot plugged a secure hard drive into my machine. He bypassed my firm's primary firewall within 3 minutes. He bypassed the secondary administrative blocks in 5. He meticulously mapped the internal network architecture Bradley had installed 2 years ago under the guise of a mandatory corporate IT upgrade. Elliot isolated a hidden subserver buried deep beneath the payroll department's standard operating system. We watched the raw data populate on the bright screen. Bradley had spent years constructing a complex labyrinth of digital shell companies. They were perfectly camouflaged as legitimate structural material suppliers and independent international consulting subcontractors. Elliot pulled up the approved internal invoices. My architectural firm was hemorrhaging massive amounts of capital, perfectly disguised as standard quarterly vendor payments. Every single one of those phantom shell companies listed Bradley as the sole managing director. He was bleeding my lifetime legacy dry right under my nose while pouring me expensive wine at my own dinner table. I felt a tight knot of pure, focused rage solidify in my chest. I instructed Elliot to bypass the current fiscal year entirely. I ordered him to dig deeper into the historical financial data. I needed to see the exact monetary flow originating from the specific date of Valerie's supposed tragic maritime accident 9 years ago. Elliot's fingers flew across his keyboard, executing a highly specialized forensic tracing algorithm. The bright monitor flashed with complex international banking codes. He locked onto the original $4 million life insurance payout issued by my provider. I had transferred those exact funds into a joint family trust immediately after the maritime funeral, genuinely believing the money would secure Naomi's financial future. Elliot highlighted the corrupt digital trail. Bradley had systematically drained that specific trust within 6 months of the memorial service. He fractured the massive sum into hundreds of untraceable microtransactions to actively avoid triggering any federal money laundering protocols. He seamlessly routed the stolen money through a notorious offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. From there, the capital was immediately consolidated and wired directly into an elite private wealth account located in Naples, Italy. The receiving account was officially registered under a newly created corporate entity. Elliot pulled the foreign incorporation documents from a secure database. The primary beneficiary of the Naples account was listed directly under Valerie's new Italian alias. My white son-in-law effectively funded his mother-in-law's luxurious new European life with the exact money generated by her violently fabricated death. I stared at the irrefutable digital proof of their monstrous conspiracy. But the ongoing financial autopsy revealed another deeply disturbing layer of structural betrayal. Elliot isolated a recurring outbound transaction originating directly from my architectural firm's primary operational budget. Every single month for the past 9 consecutive years, exactly $10,000 was illegally siphoned from my corporate accounts. The money was routed through a fake architectural consulting fee directly into a joint checking account belonging to Gerald and Evelyn. Naomi was the sole authorizing signature on every single one of those fraudulent corporate transfers. My only daughter was actively embezzling massive funds from my company to pay her grandparents their monthly blackmail money. Gerald and Evelyn knew their daughter was alive in Europe this entire time. They ruthlessly weaponized my profound grief to secure a lavish country club lifestyle, and Naomi actively facilitated the corporate theft to keep them absolutely quiet about Valerie's survival. The sheer depth of the corruption was entirely staggering. My entire family operated as a highly coordinated criminal syndicate. They treated my lifetime of work as a personal slush fund and my trauma as a highly effective control mechanism. I instructed Elliot to instantly secure every single digital record, every forged signature, and every offshore wire transfer log onto a secure offline hard drive. I needed bulletproof federal evidence to guarantee their absolute destruction. Elliot did not stop typing. He ran a predictive diagnostic scan on my firm's future scheduled corporate transfers. An automated red warning banner suddenly illuminated his screen. He turned the laptop directly toward me. Bradley had already initiated a highly sophisticated hostile takeover sequence buried deep within the bank's automated coding. He had scheduled a massive, irreversible liquidation protocol designed to execute exactly 14 days from today. The malicious protocol was programmed to immediately seize my firm's entire remaining liquid capital, instantly execute the fraudulent secondary mortgage on my Buckhead estate, and wire the consolidated funds to a new, entirely untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. Once that digital trigger flipped, my entire lifelong legacy would be instantaneously wiped out, leaving me completely bankrupt and permanently homeless. Bradley was merely waiting for the forged power of attorney document to be medically activated to legally validate the massive corporate theft. I calculated the precise timeline in my head. They planned to forcefully engineer my medical incapacitation within the next 48 hours to completely clear the legal hurdles for the final offshore transfer. The sheer arrogance of their meticulous scheme ignited a cold, terrifying clarity in my mind. They fully assumed I was a broken compliant victim, totally unaware of the blade resting heavily against my throat. I looked at Elliot. He asked me if I wanted to freeze the corporate accounts immediately and notify the local authorities to halt the automated theft. I flatly refused his suggestion. Stopping the transfer now would only scatter the treacherous cockroaches into the shadows where they could mount a legal defense. I demanded we let the 14-day clock continue ticking without interruption. We had exactly 2 weeks to completely dismantle their international conspiracy, secure my vast assets behind an impenetrable firewall, and construct a flawless legal trap. They wanted to forcefully strip me of my empire. I was going to leverage their own blinding greed to orchestrate their absolute inescapable annihilation. I sat in the center of my formal living room, reviewing architectural blueprints I had already memorized. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Naomi and Bradley walked in, flanked by a tall man wearing a sharp charcoal suit and a gold lapel pin. He looked more like a corporate liquidator than a medical professional. Naomi rushed forward with a deeply fabricated expression of absolute terror. She grabbed my hands and squeezed them tightly. She told me I had been acting dangerously erratic since I returned from Italy. She claimed I missed 3 vital client calls yesterday and left the front door wide open overnight. Both statements were complete calculated lies. Bradley stepped forward and introduced the stranger as Dr. Eris Thorne. Bradley described him as an elite private neurologist who specialized in rapid cognitive decline among high-net-worth individuals. Dr. Thorne did not carry a medical bag. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase. He sat across from me and placed a thick stack of medical evaluation forms on the glass coffee table. Bradley crossed his arms and stared down at me. He bluntly stated that my partners at the firm were deeply concerned about my sudden mental degradation. Bradley claimed he was stepping in to save my legacy before I accidentally destroyed it in a fit of senile confusion. The trap was incredibly blunt. They intended to execute the medical incapacitation protocol right here in my living room. Dr. Thorne pulled a silver pen from his jacket and leaned forward. He began firing rapid, disorienting questions at me. He asked me to identify the current date, the exact balance of my primary corporate accounts, and the names of my lead structural engineers. His tone was intentionally aggressive, designed to fluster and intimidate an elderly man into making a mistake. Naomi stood behind him, wiping non-existent tears from her eyes. She whispered to Bradley, that she simply could not bear to watch her brilliant father lose his mind. I looked at my daughter. The sheer magnitude of her sociopathy was breathtaking. She was actively paying her grandparents $10,000 a month to keep her mother's survival a secret, while standing in my home crying fake tears over my fabricated dementia. I stared at the fake doctor and his fraudulent medical forms. I knew exactly what was required of me. I had to lower their defenses completely. I had to hand them the exact illusion they desperately craved. I let the architectural blueprints slide from my hands and flutter to the floor. I weaponized their profound underestimation of my intellect. I allowed my shoulders to slump, releasing the rigid posture I had maintained for 40 years. I reached for the porcelain teacup resting on the side table. I intentionally made my hand tremble violently. The hot tea sloshed over the rim, spilling across my trousers and soaking into the expensive Persian rug. Naomi gasped in theatrical horror. I did not apologize for the spill. I looked up at the ceiling with vacant, unfocused eyes. I stammered, heavily slurring my words into an incoherent mumble. I asked Bradley what time the cruise ship was scheduled to dock. I looked directly at Naomi and asked why Valerie was completely ignoring my phone calls. The mention of my dead wife's name struck the room like a physical blow. Naomi flinched, her fake tears momentarily halting as genuine panic flashed across her eyes. Bradley stiffened quickly, exchanging a sharp, victorious look with the fake neurologist. They firmly believed I was experiencing a severe psychological break. Dr. Thorne did not conduct a single physical reflex test. He did not shine a light in my eyes or check my vital signs. He immediately pulled a finalized psychiatric evaluation form from his leather briefcase. The document was already completely filled out, citing advanced dementia, severe cognitive impairment, and a total inability to manage complex financial assets. Thorne uncapped his silver pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page with a rapid, practiced flourish. He slid the legal medical declaration across the glass table toward Bradley. The transaction was complete. The fake doctor officially declared me legally unfit to control my own life. Bradley snatched the paper eagerly, his hands shaking with pure greed. He had the medical weapon he needed to authorize the hostile corporate takeover. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute disgust and unearned triumph. He truly believed he had just conquered an empire without shedding a single drop of blood. I sat perfectly still, letting the spilled tea soak into my shoes, playing the pathetic victim flawlessly. I watched them revel in their stolen victory. I allowed my jaw to drop slightly, completing the portrait of a broken mind. They had no idea they were dancing directly into an open grave. Bradley did not waste a single second. He pulled the forged power of attorney document from his jacket pocket and slammed it onto the table directly in front of me. He placed the silver pen forcefully into my trembling hand. He leaned over me, his breath smelling of stale coffee and aggressive ambition. He ordered me to sign the transition papers immediately, promising he would handle the entire architectural firm while I rested. He assured me Valerie would want me to surrender my heavy burdens. I stared at the signature line. I let my hand shake violently, tapping the pen against the thick legal paper. I looked up at Bradley with wide, fearful eyes. I told him I understood my mind was fading. I confessed that I felt incredibly lost and entirely exhausted. Naomi stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, urging me to just sign the document and let the nightmare end. I gripped the pen tightly, stopping the manufactured trembling. I looked at Bradley and spoke with sudden razor-sharp clarity. I told him I would sign the absolute transfer of my entire estate over to him. I agreed to surrender the firm. But I flatly refused to sign my life away in the shadows of my living room like a disgraced coward. I reminded them that my architectural firm was hosting its massive 40th anniversary gala in exactly 3 days. I stated that if I were stepping down, I would do it with total dignity in front of my peers, my employees, and the city's elite press. I demanded to sign the power of attorney live on stage at the gala to publicly pass the torch of my legacy. Bradley hesitated, his eyes darting toward the fake neurologist. The delay was entirely unexpected, but the blinding allure of publicly receiving the crown to a multi-million-dollar empire was completely irresistible to his massive ego. Bradley smiled a greedy, triumphant smile and snatched the unsigned document off the table. He blindly agreed to the public transition, assuring me it would be a beautiful, historic ceremony. He led Naomi and the fake doctor out of the house, celebrating their absolute control over my fate. I watched the front doors click shut. My trembling hands became perfectly steady. Bradley had just sealed his own spectacular public execution. I drove directly from my heavily compromised estate back to the secure industrial park. Elliot was waiting inside the sterile office, his fingers already flying across his encrypted terminal. There was no time for pleasantries or emotional debriefings. The 48-hour countdown to my forced medical incapacitation was actively ticking. I placed my briefcase on the metal table and pulled out every original deed, corporate charter, and banking token I possessed. I ordered Elliot to execute a complete, irreversible financial purge. We utilized a legal mechanism designed exclusively to protect corporate titans from hostile asset seizures. Elliot generated the framework for an absolute, impenetrable, blind trust. He established the entity under heavy offshore protections, shielding it entirely from domestic probate courts and family law litigation. I picked up my gold pen. I did not hesitate. I legally transferred the total ownership of my architectural firm into the trust. I signed over the official deed to my massive Buckhead mansion. I authorized the immediate, complete draining of every single personal checking, savings, and investment account bearing my name. I swept 40 years of relentless, backbreaking corporate labor into a digital vault secured by military-grade encryption. I named Elliot as the sole absolute executor of the trust, granting him total operational control over the vast assets. I intentionally stripped myself of all financial power. On paper, I was instantly reduced to absolute destitution. I did not own the tailored suit on my back, or the luxury car parked in the driveway. I became legally penniless. The fraudulent power of attorney Bradley held in his greedy hands was now worthless. He intended to legally hijack a multi-million-dollar empire, but he would find nothing but dust and empty ledgers. Elliot processed the final administrative authorizations. He struck the enter key, locking the blind trust permanently. The digital confirmation illuminated the dark room. The architectural firm, the sprawling estate, and the millions in liquid capital vanished from my name instantly. I looked at the finalized documents. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of liberation. The parasitic leeches infesting my home were currently calculating exactly how to divide my massive wealth. They were actively fighting over the lucrative scraps of a magnificent kingdom that no longer existed. I had effectively starved the host body to eradicate the infection. Now I needed to meticulously arrange their absolute federal execution. I instructed Elliot to ensure no digital breadcrumbs remained on any domestic server. He routed the confirmation receipts through 3 separate international proxies. We destroyed the physical hard drives containing the original transfer protocols. I was a ghost in my own financial empire. The trap was perfectly set. Elliot shifted his focus from the defensive perimeter to the offensive strike. He pulled up a secure communication channel specifically reserved for high-level federal whistleblowers. He bypassed local law enforcement entirely. A multi-million-dollar international life insurance fraud involving a fabricated maritime death fell strictly under federal jurisdiction. Elliot initiated a direct encrypted connection with a specialized senior agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agent answered the call immediately, recognizing Elliot's secure credential marker. Elliot did not waste time with introductory context. He bluntly outlined the massive conspiracy. He detailed the fake death at sea, the staged mourning, and the active ongoing financial exploitation. The federal agent demanded immediate actionable proof. Elliot hit a single key on his terminal. He transmitted the massive cache of intercepted digital evidence directly into the federal database. The transmission included the offshore wire transfer logs, clearly linking Bradley's shell companies to Valerie's new alias in Naples. It included the internal corporate audits proving Naomi was systematically embezzling $10,000 every month to fund Gerald and Evelyn's silence. Finally, Elliot transmitted the high-definition video I recorded in Milan, irrefutably proving the deceased woman was alive, thriving, and spending stolen American insurance capital in Italy. The silence on the secure line was heavy and profound. The federal agent reviewed the undeniable mountain of evidence. The sheer scale of the coordinated family fraud triggered an immediate high-priority federal response. The agent confirmed the receipt of the files and officially classified the situation as an active Tier 1 criminal investigation. Elliot provided the exact time and location of the upcoming architectural gala. He explicitly stated that all the primary conspirators would be gathered in one single public room. The federal agent agreed to the tactical arrangement. The call disconnected. The federal machinery silently roared to life. Heavily armed tactical units, forensic accountants, and international extradition specialists began silently mobilizing toward Atlanta. Interpol would be engaged to handle the Italian extraction. My treacherous family believed they were seamlessly gliding toward a massive unearned payday. They were blind to the federal crosshairs currently locking onto their foreheads. The trap was rapidly closing, and there was no escape. Bradley thought his digital laundering was invisible. Naomi thought her embezzlement was flawlessly hidden. They were mistaken. Every stolen dollar was a heavy nail hammered directly into their collective coffin. The federal hammer was raised ready to shatter their illusion permanently. I returned to my estate later that evening. The suffocating tension inside the house was thick enough to slice with a knife. I walked down the grand marble hallway toward the master suite. Gerald and Evelyn stepped out from the shadows of the formal dining room, blocking my path. Their faces were twisted into identical masks of aggressive entitlement. Evelyn crossed her arms tightly across her chest, demanding my immediate attention. Gerald stepped aggressively into my personal space. He demanded I sign the physical deed of the Buckhead mansion directly over to them before the anniversary gala tomorrow night. He claimed the massive estate was simply too much burden for a man with a rapidly failing mind. Evelyn instantly weaponized her dead daughter's memory. She claimed that Valerie always wanted her beloved parents to retire in this exact house. She stated I owed them the property as a final act of penance for letting their daughter die in the cold ocean. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their demand tested my physical restraint. They were standing in a house I built with my own hands, demanding the keys, while actively hiding the woman they claimed to mourn. I looked directly into Gerald's greedy, demanding eyes. I did not flinch. I did not display a single ounce of anger or resentment. I forced my facial muscles into a wide, painfully warm smile. I reached out and gently patted Gerald's shoulder, playing the role of the broken, compliant victim to absolute perfection. I told them their request was completely reasonable. I agreed that Valerie would indeed want them to have the house. I promised them I had already drafted the official property transfer documents. Evelyn smiled viciously, reaching out her hand to take the non-existent paperwork. I stepped back smoothly. I told them a private hallway was no place for such a significant family milestone. I promised to hand them the official, binding deed to the mansion, live on stage at the gala tomorrow night. I insisted they dress in their absolute best formal attire to receive their magnificent gift in front of the city. Gerald beamed with greedy satisfaction, blindly accepting the glorious promise. They stepped aside, allowing me to pass. They had eagerly accepted their front-row tickets to their own total destruction. I walked into my bedroom and closed the heavy door. The execution stage was set. I stood in the center of my master bedroom, sliding the fraudulent power of attorney document into my breast pocket. My encrypted mobile device vibrated sharply against my ribs. I answered the call immediately. Elliot did not bother with a greeting. He stated he had successfully cloned Bradley's personal cellular device utilizing the administrative backdoors he installed during the corporate mainframe breach. Bradley thought his secondary mobile phone was entirely invisible to local networks. Elliot had effortlessly stripped away the encryption and routed the live audio feed directly to my secure line. I raised the phone to my ear. I heard the unmistakable sound of my daughter pacing frantically across the hardwood floors of my downstairs hallway. The digital tone of an international ring cut through the static. The line connected. Valerie answered the phone. Her voice drifted through the speaker, carrying the ambient noise of a busy Italian street. Naomi did not offer a warm family greeting. She immediately launched into a hysterical, panicked rant. She screamed that my decision to delay the legal transition was a massive vulnerability. She complained bitterly that I refused to sign the final documents in the living room. Naomi described my sudden demand for a public transition at the 40th anniversary gala as an unacceptable risk. She whined that Bradley was currently struggling to hold the offshore banking channels open without triggering an international regulatory freeze. Naomi feared I might suddenly change my mind on stage or suffer a catastrophic moment of clarity in front of the local press. She demanded Valerie authorize an immediate alternative solution. She stated they needed absolute control over my architectural empire by tomorrow morning, not 3 days from now. I listened to my only child complain about my extended survival as if it were a minor logistical inconvenience. I held my breath, waiting for my dead wife to respond. The raw audio feed hissed with electronic interference. Valerie did not attempt to soothe her daughter's frantic anxiety. She did not offer maternal comfort. She sighed heavily, expressing profound irritation at Naomi's lack of strategic discipline. Valerie coldly reminded Naomi that millions of dollars were currently suspended in digital transit. She stated that waiting for an unpredictable old man to voluntarily surrender his kingdom was the ultimate mark of an amateur. She scolded Naomi for allowing me to dictate the terms of my own surrender. Valerie demanded absolute, irreversible certainty. She reminded Naomi that the entire structural integrity of their operation relied on flawless execution. The conversation shifted instantly from corporate theft to something vastly more sinister. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, listening to the two women I had spent my entire life protecting actively plot my permanent removal from the board. Valerie's voice cut through the digital static with terrifying precision. She commanded Naomi to stop waiting for meaningless signatures. Valerie stated that signatures could be challenged in a federal probate court by ambitious corporate lawyers. She declared that medical incapacitation could never be legally contested. Valerie meticulously outlined a new lethal directive. She reminded Naomi about the mild heart condition I developed 5 years ago after the intense stress of the maritime investigation. She instructed my daughter to weaponize that exact vulnerability. Valerie ordered Naomi to completely swap my daily cardiovascular medication. She told her to replace the standard white blood pressure pills with a massive concentrated dose of black market amphetamines. Valerie coldly explained the biological mechanics of the assassination. The heavy stimulants would instantly overload my fragile cardiovascular system. The sudden chemical spike would induce a massive, catastrophic stroke long before the first guest ever arrived at the anniversary gala. Valerie detailed the brilliant simplicity of the murder. A sudden stroke would appear entirely natural for a 70-year-old man suffering from rapid, severe cognitive decline. The attending emergency room physicians would immediately declare me medically incapacitated. That specific legal classification would instantly trigger the fraudulent power of attorney document. Bradley would gain absolute operational control over my entire architectural empire the exact second the paramedics placed me on a ventilator. They could digitally liquidate my entire life's work, authorize the offshore transfers, and silently pull the plug on my life support before the weekend ended. Naomi did not gasp. She did not hesitate or express a single ounce of moral hesitation regarding her father's premeditated murder. She simply asked Valerie how quickly Bradley could source the lethal stimulants. Valerie promised the unlabeled red capsules were already secured in Bradley's personal safe, purchased weeks ago as a mandatory contingency plan. The international call disconnected with a sharp electronic click. The audio feed went completely dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The cold, mechanical reality of the situation locked into place. My family had officially abandoned financial extortion. They had crossed the definitive line into premeditated murder. They had fully calculated the exact value of my life and decided my immediate death was exponentially more profitable than my continued existence. I stood in the absolute silence of my room, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their treachery. I ended the secure connection with Elliot. I placed my encrypted device on the nightstand. The suffocating silence of the master bedroom pressed against my chest. I needed absolute physical confirmation of the auditory horror I had just witnessed. I turned and walked deliberately toward the master bathroom. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I moved through the shadows, stepping silently across the heated marble floor. I stopped directly in front of the mirrored medicine cabinet. I reached out and pulled the glass door open. I stared at the plastic 7-day pill organizer resting on the middle glass shelf. I kept that organizer meticulously stocked to manage my blood pressure and heart rhythm. I picked up the plastic container. The streetlights outside cast a pale, sharp glow across the transparent compartments. I popped open the lid designated for tomorrow morning. I tipped the container forward and poured the contents directly into the palm of my hand. My standard, familiar white medication was completely missing. Sitting in the center of my hand were 3 oversized, unmarked red capsules. I stared at the lethal dosage. The bright red plastic shells looked like drops of fresh blood against my dark skin. Bradley and Naomi had already infiltrated my private sanctuary. They had systematically loaded the fatal weapon and placed it directly into my morning routine. They fully expected me to blindly swallow the poison, trusting the daughter who poured my coffee to preserve my health. A profound, bone-chilling calm washed over my entire nervous system. Any lingering trace of paternal mercy I harbored for Naomi instantly died on the cold marble floor. I was no longer dealing with greedy relatives or entitled heirs. I was actively cohabitating with ruthless, calculating assassins. I did not flush the toxic pills down the drain. I did not throw them into the trash. I carefully transferred the unmarked red capsules into a small, sterile plastic evidence bag I kept in my travel kit. I sealed the bag tightly and slipped it into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The lethal evidence rested heavily against my beating heart. I looked at my reflection in the dark mirror. The old grieving widower they intended to murder was completely gone. I closed the medicine cabinet. I was ready to attend my final dinner with the executioners. The massive crystal chandelier above the formal dining table cast sharp, jagged shadows across the bone china. It was the night before the 40th anniversary gala. Bradley and Naomi had insisted on hosting an intimate celebratory dinner to honor my upcoming retirement. They sat across from me playing the roles of loving family members, while actively waiting for my cardiovascular system to violently collapse. The tension in the room was thick, metallic, and entirely suffocating. Bradley leaned across the expensive floral centerpiece and aggressively poured a heavy measure of dark Cabernet into my crystal glass. He practically ordered me to drink, claiming the vintage wine would magically calm my frazzled nerves before tomorrow's massive public transition. I did not touch the glass. I picked up my silver knife and fork, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate precision. I chewed my food in absolute terrifying silence. Naomi sat rigid in her high-backed chair, her eyes tracking my every single movement. She watched my hands for sudden tremors. She stared at my face, actively waiting for the left side of my jaw to drop, or my speech to instantly slur. She fully believed I had ingested the lethal red amphetamines she carefully planted in my pill organizer that morning. She expected the fatal stroke to trigger at any given second. The toxic anticipation radiated from her pores like cheap perfume. Every time I cleared my throat or shifted my weight, Bradley gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, ready to spring into action and dial the paramedics to execute the final phase of their hostile takeover. I weaponized my total silence. I offered zero social comfort. I did not ask about their day. I did not discuss the logistics of the upcoming gala. I simply stared back at them with eyes completely devoid of any human warmth. The psychological pressure of my silence began to physically crush them. Naomi's breathing grew incredibly shallow and uneven. Bradley desperately filled the dead air with nervous, fabricated laughter, rambling endlessly about how excited the firm's board of directors was for his impending leadership. I let his pathetic monologue echo against the dining room walls completely unanswered. I finished my meal, placed my silver utensils perfectly parallel on the porcelain plate, and stood up from the table. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and stated I required absolute rest before the monumental events of tomorrow evening. I turned my back on my executioners, leaving them completely paralyzed by the agonizing delay of my manufactured demise. They were trapped in a psychological hell of their own creation, watching a dead man stubbornly refuse to fall to the floor. I walked down the dark hallway and entered my private study, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The time for passive observation was permanently over. The final execution required immaculate preparation. I walked over to the leather sofa and placed my sleek black leather briefcase on the cushions. I popped the brass locks, opening the empty chamber that would carry the absolute destruction of my entire family. I moved to my desk and opened the secured files Elliot had personally delivered earlier that afternoon. I grabbed the master financial audits. The thick stack of paper explicitly detailed Bradley's vast labyrinth of digital shell companies and his systematic embezzlement of corporate funds. I placed the irrefutable financial proof into the first compartment of the briefcase. I picked up the sealed federal indictments. The Department of Justice had officially documented the international wire fraud, the money laundering, and the illegal transfer of the $4 million death benefit directly to Italy. I slid the federal warrants directly behind the financial audits. Next, I secured the medical documents. I added the neurological evaluation Dr. Thorne had fraudulently signed in my living room, perfectly paired with a certified psychiatric evaluation I had personally obtained from a leading state medical board earlier that exact same morning. My legitimate medical records completely destroyed their fabricated narrative of severe cognitive decline. I then picked up the visual executioner. I held the stack of massive, high-definition photographs I took in Milan. The glossy images showcased Valerie thriving in her luxurious Italian life, smiling alongside her new husband and her identical triplets. The visual proof of the maritime fake death fraud was undeniable. I carefully slid the photographs into the central compartment of the briefcase. Finally, I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I pulled out the sterile plastic evidence bag containing the lethal red amphetamine capsules Naomi had placed in my bathroom. The physical proof of premeditated attempted murder glowed dangerously under the desk lamp. I placed the evidence bag into the front zipper pocket of the briefcase, ensuring it would be the ultimate weapon deployed on stage. I snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp, echoing click. My arsenal was fully assembled. The briefcase contained the concentrated power to instantly obliterate 5 human lives. I stood over the leather case, feeling the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a master architect who had just finished laying the foundation for a flawless demolition. A soft, hesitant knock echoed against the heavy oak door of my study. I stepped away from the loaded briefcase and unlocked the deadbolt. Naomi stood in the dimly lit hallway. She wore a silk nightgown, clutching her hands nervously in front of her chest. She looked up at me, actively searching my face for any microscopic sign of cardiovascular failure. Her eyes darted to my hands, checking for the fatal tremors that the red capsules were supposed to induce hours ago. She hid her escalating panic behind a flawless mask of devoted filial concern. She stepped into the study, invading my personal space. She wrapped her arms around my neck, leaning in to deliver the ultimate Judas kiss. She pressed her lips against my cheek, her skin cold and clammy against mine. She whispered softly in my ear, pouring pure venom directly into my brain. She told me that I was making the right decision, by stepping down and surrendering the firm to Bradley tomorrow night. She tightened her grip around my neck and murmured that her mother would be incredibly proud of my noble sacrifice. She weaponized Valerie's fabricated ghost one final time, using the memory of a fake drowning to manipulate my signature on a fraudulent document. She pulled back and offered a tender, manufactured smile, fully expecting me to weep with gratitude. I looked at my only daughter. I did not blink. I did not return the embrace. My face was carved from solid granite. I stared directly through her false eyes, piercing the dark, murderous void of her soul. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripped of all paternal affection and human warmth. I told Naomi that I completely agreed with her assessment. I stated that tomorrow night would be an absolutely historic event that our family would remember for the rest of their lives. I locked my eyes onto hers and replied that Valerie would definitely be present at the 40th anniversary gala in ways Naomi could not possibly imagine. My daughter's fake smile faltered instantly. The profound certainty in my voice sent a visible, violent shiver down her spine. She took a slow step backward, her brain desperately trying to decode the terrifying gravity of my statement. I reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the oak door, and gently closed it directly in her pale face. The trap was locked. The ghost of Milan was about to materialize. The grand ballroom of the downtown Waldorf Astoria radiated with the blinding brilliance of absolute opulence. I had personally designed the hotel's interior acoustics and lighting architecture 2 decades ago. Tonight, the space served as the glittering arena for my firm's 40th anniversary gala. 300 of the most influential figures in the city occupied the room. Elite real estate developers, aggressive venture capitalists, leading structural engineers, and a swarm of hungry financial journalists mingled beneath the cascading crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the sophisticated low-frequency roar of massive wealth changing hands. Waiters in immaculate white jackets circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. It was a flawless monument to my lifelong dedication, and Bradley was treating it like his own personal coronation. I watched from the absolute perimeter. Bradley strutted across the polished marble floor with the sickening swagger of a conquering emperor. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than most of my junior architects earned in a month. He moved aggressively from table to table, shaking hands and clapping senior partners on the shoulder. He possessed the terrifying confidence of a man completely devoid of a conscience. I could read his lips from across the room. He was actively introducing himself to the international press corps as the incoming chief executive officer of my architectural empire. He spoke in hushed, respectfully somber tones about the tragic necessity of corporate succession. He was systematically laying the psychological groundwork for my forced medical retirement. Bradley flashed his perfect, blinding smile at a group of heavy-hitting commercial investors, assuring them that the firm's future portfolio was safe under his visionary leadership. He was selling my legacy for parts before the ink on his fraudulent documents even existed. The sheer arrogance of his performance was breathtaking. He truly believed he had successfully outmaneuvered a titan. He was entirely unaware that the federal government was actively monitoring his offshore bank accounts at this exact moment. I remained cloaked in the heavy shadows near the raised audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. I gripped the handle of my sleek black leather briefcase. The execution orders were secure inside. I scanned the floor and located the primary VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. The parasitic elements of my family had officially assembled to claim their unearned spoils. Gerald and Evelyn sat aggressively in the center seats. They were dressed in loud, ostentatious evening wear, completely unsuited for a professional corporate event. Evelyn was actively swirling an expensive crystal glass of vintage Merlot, her eyes darting hungrily around the ballroom. She was calculating the sheer net worth of the room. Gerald sat rigidly beside her, his fingers impatiently tapping the pristine white tablecloth. He was actively waiting for me to walk onto that stage and hand him the physical deed to my multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion. They firmly believed they were mere minutes away from securing a luxurious permanent retirement, funded by my orchestrated demise. My gaze shifted directly to Naomi. She sat to the immediate left of her grandparents, but her posture was violently different. She was not celebrating. She was radiating pure, unadulterated panic. Naomi continuously checked the diamond watch strapped to her wrist. Her eyes darted frantically across the massive crowd, aggressively searching the perimeter, until her vision finally locked onto my position in the shadows. I stood perfectly upright. I did not lean against the wall. I did not clutch my chest. I offered her a slow, chillingly steady smile. The color instantly drained from my daughter's face. She looked like she had just seen a walking corpse. Naomi knew exactly what those red amphetamine capsules were designed to do. She knew that a man with my cardiovascular history should currently be laying on a gurney with a violently ruptured brain aneurysm. My continued flawless vertical existence completely defied her murderous biological calculations. Her hands began to shake so violently she had to drop her champagne flute onto the table. I watched her mind fracture in real time as she realized the assassination protocol had catastrophically failed. The heavy ballroom doors closed, and the massive crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft, theatrical glow. A sharp spotlight illuminated the center of the main stage. Bradley separated himself from the crowd of investors and practically leaped up the carpeted stairs. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket and grabbed the silver microphone from the center stand. He looked out over the sea of 300 elite guests and adopted an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. Bradley delivered a highly emotional, deeply fabricated speech designed to perfectly execute his hostilité cacao. He spoke passionately about my unmatched architectural brilliance and the 40 years I spent constructing the skyline of the city. He then expertly lowered his voice to a somber whisper echoing through the massive speakers. He informed the quiet room that brilliant minds are often the most fragile. Bradley publicly claimed that the horrific tragic loss of my beloved wife Valerie 9 years ago had slowly eroded my cognitive stability. He painted a pathetic, heartbreaking portrait of a grieving widower who could no longer handle the massive stress of a global empire. Bradley looked directly into the cameras of the financial press. He humbly declared himself the reluctant but dutiful savior of the firm. He announced that tonight, to preserve my pristine honor, I would officially step down and sign the executive transition documents in front of my peers. The crowd murmured in sympathetic agreement, completely manipulated by his flawless performance. Bradley turned toward the shadows of the audiovisual booth and extended his hand toward me. He dramatically invited me to the stage to sign my legacy away. He flashed a greedy, victorious smile, fully believing the trap was perfectly sprung. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit. I gripped my heavy leather briefcase. I stepped out of the darkness and began my long, deliberate walk down the center aisle. I was ready to unleash absolute, inescapable destruction. The polite, sympathetic applause rippled through the grand ballroom as I moved down the center aisle. 300 pairs of eyes tracked my slow, deliberate progression. They fully expected to see a broken, hollow shell of a man shuffling toward his inevitable obsolescence. Instead, I walked with the rigid, predatory posture of a corporate titan preparing for an absolute war. My spine was perfectly straight. My gaze was locked entirely on Bradley. The pathetic whispers of pity from the VIP tables died instantly as I passed them, replaced by a sudden, confused silence. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom were already locked and secured by elite private security personnel I had personally hired that afternoon. No one was leaving this room until the demolition was totally complete. I climbed the carpeted stairs to the main stage with a firm, heavy stride. Bradley stood waiting behind the thick acrylic podium. His manufactured smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he registered the absolute calculating coldness in my eyes. He quickly recovered, projecting an aura of fake, loving concern for the flashing cameras of the financial press. He reached out to place a comforting, patronizing hand on my shoulder. I smoothly sidestepped his touch, leaving his hand grasping at empty air. I placed my black leather briefcase heavily onto the podium, the solid thud echoing ominously through the sound system. Bradley nervously cleared his throat and slid the fraudulent power of attorney document directly into the center of the podium. He picked up a heavy engraved gold pen and held it out to me with a grand theatrical gesture. He leaned in, his eyes silently pleading with me to surrender the empire. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the historic transfer of power. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the forged legal document designed to strip me of my entire existence and leave me completely destitute. I reached out and took the pen from his trembling fingers. I did not move toward the paper. I wrapped my hands around the polished metal casing and snapped the gold pen completely in half. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot across the silent ballroom. Dark ink splattered across the pristine white surface of the transition document, ruining the forged paperwork. I dropped the broken, useless pieces directly onto Bradley's signature line. Before he could process the sheer violence of the gesture, I reached out and ripped the silver microphone forcefully from his grip. Bradley stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but the absolute authority in my posture paralyzed his vocal cords. I turned away from him and looked directly toward the raised audiovisual booth at the back of the room. Elliot was standing in the shadows, his hands resting on the master control console. I gave him a single sharp nod. The massive digital projector suspended above the stage instantly ignited. It did not display the familiar, elegant logo of my architectural firm. The 30-foot screen illuminated with a highly detailed, undeniable financial schematic. The sheer volume of raw, incriminating data drew a collective gasp from the 300 elite guests. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers, completely stripped of any manufactured weakness or senile hesitation. I announced to the room that my incoming successor had indeed been extremely busy managing the firm's capital over the last 24 months. I directed the crowd's attention to the massive screen behind me. I methodically detailed the exact international routing numbers, the hidden offshore accounts, and the complex labyrinth of phantom shell companies Bradley had constructed in the Cayman Islands. I highlighted the precise dates and massive monetary amounts he had actively embezzled from our primary operational budget. The journalists in the front row instantly recognized the catastrophic gravity of the data. Camera flashes erupted like a violent lightning storm, capturing every single piece of evidence. I explained with surgical precision how Bradley had systematically bled my life's work dry to fund his own failing international consulting startup. The detailed, approved internal invoices flashed across the screen in rapid succession, bearing his exact signature as the sole managing director of every single fraudulent vendor. The crowd of investors, developers, and senior board members began to murmur in profound, aggressive outrage. The room was turning against him. Bradley stood frozen on the stage behind me, his pristine midnight blue tuxedo suddenly feeling like a heavy prison uniform. He looked wildly at the exits, but the security guards stood firm. He was entirely trapped in the blinding glare of his own absolute public exposure, watching his entire professional future disintegrate in front of the city's most powerful elite. A shrill, hysterical scream suddenly shattered the rising chaos in the ballroom. Naomi leaped from her seat at the VIP table. She knocked over her crystal champagne flute, shattering the expensive glass loudly across the polished marble floor. She pointed frantically at the audiovisual booth, screaming at the hotel technicians to cut the digital feed immediately. She ordered the security team to storm the stage, desperately trying to salvage the rapidly collapsing illusion of my dementia. She shouted at the top of her lungs that her father was suffering a severe tragic psychological break and needed immediate medical sedation to prevent further embarrassment. Elliot did not flinch. He struck another sequence of keys on his master console. The massive screen behind me switched instantly. The offshore banking ledgers vanished, replaced by a brilliant high-resolution scan of my official psychiatric evaluation. The State Medical Board seal glowed brightly in the center of the document. The date stamp boldly displayed this exact morning, rendering any previous medical claims entirely obsolete. I turned the microphone back to the crowd, completely drowning out Naomi's frantic, echoing screams. I read the finalized medical conclusion aloud. The certified neurological specialist had officially declared my cognitive function to be absolutely exceptional, completely disproving any trace of psychological decline. I looked directly down at my daughter and her treacherous husband. I loudly declared to the entire room that my mind was razor-sharp and entirely focused. I announced that I was not stepping down, I was not surrendering my empire, and I was certainly not suffering from any form of dementia. I stated with lethal, echoing clarity that my entire family had engaged in a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar campaign of extreme elder financial abuse designed to forcefully seize my lifelong legacy. The ballroom erupted into absolute uncontainable pandemonium. The financial reporters scrambled to record every single word, dictating the explosive scandal into their devices. Gerald and Evelyn sat petrified at their table, their faces completely ashen and slick with cold sweat. They finally realized that the magnificent kingdom they had eagerly arrived to conquer was actually a perfectly constructed, inescapable slaughterhouse. The gilded trap had snapped shut. The acoustics of the grand ballroom magnified the absolute chaos into a deafening roar. 300 industry elites, investors, and journalists simultaneously erupted. Flashing cameras strobed across the stage like a violent electrical storm, capturing the exact moment Bradley's pristine corporate facade shattered into jagged, desperate pieces. The sheer magnitude of his public execution finally registered in his brain. Panic instantly mutated into primal, uncontrollable rage. He let out a visceral, animalistic scream and lunged across the acrylic podium. His hands violently reached for the silver microphone gripped tightly in my fist. He intended to physically tear the truth from my hands and silence the broadcast by force. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Before Bradley could cross the 2 feet separating us, a heavy shadow detached itself from the audiovisual booth. Elliot moved with the brutal, kinetic efficiency of a man who had spent his former career neutralizing highly volatile threats. He vaulted onto the side steps of the stage, closed the distance in a fraction of a second, and intercepted Bradley mid-lunge. Elliot slammed his open palms directly into Bradley's chest. The impact was sickeningly loud over the ambient roar of the crowd. Bradley was violently shoved backward. His expensive leather shoes lost traction on the polished floor. He collided heavily with the acrylic podium, knocking it sideways before crashing down onto the stage. The heavy thud of his body hitting the wooden platform silenced the front row of the audience. Elliot stood over him, adjusting his glasses with cold, mechanical precision. He did not say a single word. His physical presence radiated an absolute lethal warning that any further aggressive movement would be met with overwhelming force. Bradley stayed on the floor, gasping for air, completely neutralized. I stepped around the fallen podium and raised the silver microphone to my lips. I commanded the entire ballroom to be absolutely silent. My voice sliced through the remaining murmurs like a steel blade. I ordered the journalists to keep their cameras raised and their lenses focused. I instructed the 300 powerful guests to look away from the pathetic man gasping on the floor and turn their attention back to the massive digital screen. I declared that the financial embezzlement they just witnessed was merely the prologue to a much darker, far more sinister conspiracy. I reminded the room that the architectural empire they respected was currently bleeding out because of the absolute treachery of the man lying on the stage. I refused to let the audience blink. I directed their gaze upward, signaling that the corporate theft was only the outer layer of a deeply rotten core. I demanded they witness the ultimate truth behind my family's legendary tragedy. I delivered a sharp, silent hand signal to the back of the room. Elliot did not take his eyes off Bradley, but his left hand reached back and tapped the master console. The massive 30-foot screen behind me flickered. The damning spreadsheets of offshore corporate theft instantly vanished. The screen went completely black for one agonizing second. Then a brilliant high-definition photograph flooded the ballroom with vibrant color. The image stretched across the stage, massive and entirely undeniable. It was the photograph I had personally captured in the sunlit piazza in Milan just days ago. The crowd collectively stopped breathing. Staring down at the 300 elite guests was Valerie. My supposedly deceased wife was entirely alive, radiating perfect health and absolute joy. She was wearing designer sunglasses and laughing openly. She was holding hands with her wealthy Italian husband. They were flanked by her 3 identical teenage triplets. The visual proof was absolute, irrefutable, and completely devastating. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the ballroom. Every single person in that room had attended Valerie's tragic maritime memorial service 9 years ago. They had worn black, they had offered me their deepest condolences, and they had wept for a woman swallowed by the ocean. Now they were staring at a high-resolution ghost, living a luxurious European fantasy. The sheer psychological shock paralyzed the entire audience. At the central VIP table, the physical reality of the exposure finally struck Gerald and Evelyn. They had weaponized their fake grief for nearly a decade, using it to extract an endless stream of blackmail money from my company accounts. They sat perfectly rigid, their faces completely drained of blood. Evelyn's jaw trembled uncontrollably. The expensive crystal wine glass she had been swirling slipped from her weak, paralyzed fingers. It struck the polished marble floor. The sharp, violent sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. Gerald dropped his own champagne flute an instant later. The dark red wine and golden champagne pooled together across the pristine white tiles, looking exactly like fresh blood. They were completely exposed. The audience turned their heads, staring in utter disgust at the grieving parents who had actively participated in their own daughter's fabricated death. Naomi sat between them, perfectly frozen. Her diamond watch dug into her wrist as she stared at the massive projection of her mother. The foundational lie of her entire adult life was currently being broadcast in high definition to the city's most powerful elite. The ghost had officially materialized, and she brought the absolute destruction of their criminal syndicate with her. I did not allow the shock to dissipate. I capitalized on the absolute paralysis gripping the room. I walked directly to the edge of the stage, lowering the microphone to address the front row of hungry financial journalists. I locked eyes with the lead investigative reporter from the city's largest business journal. I officially announced the execution of a $4 million international life insurance fraud. My voice boomed across the silent ballroom, clear and unyielding. I meticulously detailed how the tragic maritime accident was a highly coordinated, brilliantly executed fake death. I officially named Naomi, Bradley, Gerald, and Evelyn as active co-conspirators who actively facilitated the fraud and systematically laundered the illicit payout through offshore accounts directly to Italy. I watched the journalists rapidly type every single syllable, their eyes wide, with the realization that they were witnessing the greatest corporate and criminal scandal of the decade. The guests shifted in their seats, backing away from the VIP table, as if my family were carrying a highly contagious disease. I did not stop at financial crimes. I escalated the execution to its absolute lethal peak. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out the sterile plastic evidence bag. The bright stage lights instantly caught the transparent plastic and the 3 oversized unmarked red capsules sealed inside. I held the bag high above my head, ensuring every camera in the room focused perfectly on the lethal dosage. I pointed my finger directly at Naomi. She shrank back into her chair, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. I loudly declared to the entire room that my daughter had infiltrated my private sanctuary this very morning. I explained that she had meticulously removed my daily cardiovascular medication and replaced it with a massive fatal dose of black market amphetamines. I announced that the pills I was holding were explicitly designed to induce a catastrophic fatal stroke before I could reach this stage. I accused my only child and her husband of crossing the line from corporate extortion directly into premeditated murder. I stated that their blinding greed had driven them to orchestrate my biological assassination, simply to accelerate their inheritance and execute their hostile takeover. The flashing cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing the red pills, the massive photograph of Valerie, and the terrified, cornered faces of my treacherous family. The trap was permanently sealed. The blinding flash of hundreds of press cameras captured the exact moment Bradley's absolute hubris evaporated into pure primal terror. The towering digital projection of Valerie's vibrant Italian life and the damning offshore ledgers loomed over him like a digital guillotine. He stood frozen on the velvet stage, his midnight blue tuxedo suddenly suffocating him as the sheer crushing gravity of federal exposure locked around his throat. The polite murmurs of the 300 industry elites violently escalated into a deafening hostile roar. Bradley looked at the unblinking lenses of the financial journalists. He looked at the plastic evidence bag containing the lethal red amphetamines gripped firmly in my raised hand. His meticulously calculated corporate takeover had instantly mutated into a highly publicized, inescapable crime scene. His predatory confidence shattered completely. His primitive survival instincts violently hijacked his paralyzed nervous system. Bradley spun away from the shattered gold pen and the ruined transition documents. He leaped off the side of the stage, his expensive leather shoes slamming heavily against the polished marble floor. He did not look back at Naomi. He completely abandoned his wife, his conspirators, and his stolen empire in a desperate, singular bid for self-preservation. He locked his panicked gaze onto the heavy brass-plated swinging doors leading to the hotel's rear catering kitchens. It was the only blind spot in the grand ballroom, a narrow, dimly lit service corridor that offered a microscopic chance of vanishing into the downtown Atlanta shadows. Bradley aggressively shoved his way through the chaotic crowd. He violently knocked a silver tray of champagne flutes from a waiter's hands, sending shattered crystal and expensive vintage wine flying across the floor. He desperately sprinted toward the kitchen exit, his lungs burning with the toxic adrenaline of a cornered animal. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy wooden service doors, expecting them to yield to the empty culinary corridors. The double doors swung inward with violent explosive force, but they did not open for him. A heavily armed, highly coordinated tactical unit of federal agents flooded directly into the ballroom. They wore dark Kevlar vests emblazoned with bold yellow FBI insignias. Their boots hammered against the marble floor in perfect, terrifying unison. Bradley slammed directly into an impenetrable wall of federal authority. The narrow escape route was completely choked with specialized law enforcement officers. They immediately surrounded the disgraced architect, cutting off every conceivable avenue of retreat. Bradley's desperate sprint ended in an abrupt, absolute dead end. He was completely surrounded, outmaneuvered, and permanently trapped. The lead federal agent did not offer Bradley a single moment to negotiate or surrender with dignity. The agent stepped forward and drove a heavy tactical strike directly into Bradley's chest, violently sweeping his legs out from under him. Bradley crashed brutally against the cold marble floor. The impact knocked the remaining breath from his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. Two agents instantly dropped their body weight onto his back, pinning the disgraced executive flat against the expensive tiles. Bradley thrashed wildly, his tailored midnight blue jacket tearing at the seams as he desperately tried to buck the heavy officers off his spine. The physical resistance was entirely futile. A federal agent seized Bradley's wrists, twisting his arms aggressively behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists with a sharp, metallic click. The brilliant visionary architect was reduced to a panting, restrained criminal bleeding onto the floor of his own magnificent gala. Simultaneously, a secondary tactical team converged directly on the primary VYP table. Naomi watched her husband get brutally tackled to the marble floor. The immaculate, composed facade of the devoted daughter instantly disintegrated. As two federal agents stepped toward her, Naomi leaped backward from her high-backed chair. An agent firmly grabbed her shoulder, slamming her roughly against the edge of the table. The expensive china and crystal glasses clattered loudly around her. Naomi immediately resorted to the only survival tactic she possessed. She opened her mouth and began screaming hysterically, weaponizing her own treacherous family to save herself. She shrieked that she was a completely innocent victim of extreme psychological manipulation. She loudly begged the federal agents for absolute legal immunity, frantically promising to testify against everyone in the room. Naomi explicitly screamed that Bradley had forced her to embezzle the corporate funds. She wildly pointed at the massive digital projection of Valerie, loudly declaring that her mother had exclusively orchestrated the international life insurance fraud and engineered the lethal amphetamine assassination plot. My only child completely abandoned a lifetime of loyalty in a fraction of a second. She ruthlessly offered the federal government the severed heads of her husband and her mother on a silver platter, desperately trying to purchase her own freedom with their complete destruction. The parasitic nature of her soul was fully brilliantly exposed under the blinding ballroom lights. The sheer volume of the federal raid created a massive wave of sensory confusion across the grand ballroom. Guests shouted in shock, reporters scrambled for better vantage points, and tactical agents shouted authoritative commands over the deafening noise. Gerald and Evelyn recognized the catastrophic collapse of their lucrative extortion syndicate instantly. They did not attempt to defend their granddaughter as she shrieked for immunity. They did not run to the stage to protest their innocence. Like true seasoned opportunists, they attempted to quietly slip away unnoticed. Evelyn grabbed Gerald's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deeply into the sleeve of his dark suit. They lowered their heads entirely, avoiding eye contact with the surrounding crowd. They moved with slow, calculated stealth, navigating carefully along the velvet-draped walls toward the dimly lit side lobby exit. They firmly believed their advanced age and unassuming posture would render them invisible to the federal sweep. They desperately hoped to walk out of the luxury hotel and completely disappear into the night before the agents could untangle the massive web of financial deceit. They reached the shadowed threshold of the side lobby. Gerald reached out to push the brass handle of the exit door. I stepped directly out of the darkness and completely blocked their path. The color instantly vanished from their wrinkled faces. Gerald's hand froze mid-air. Evelyn gasped, taking a sharp, terrified step backward. I did not raise my voice. I did not express a single ounce of anger. I looked at the two treacherous blackmailers who had happily profited from my fabricated grief for nearly a decade. I offered them a cold, ruthlessly polite smile. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded piece of heavy parchment paper. I held it out toward Gerald. I calmly reminded him that I had promised to hand him the official binding deed to my massive Buckhead estate before the end of the evening. I insisted he take his magnificent, highly anticipated gift. Gerald's hands trembled violently as he took the folded paper from my steady grip. He slowly opened the heavy parchment. He stared down at the document. The page was entirely blank, except for a single word written in bold black ink across the exact center. Fraud. Gerald's breathing stopped completely. He looked up at me with hollow, defeated eyes. Heavy tactical boots stepped into the narrow corridor directly behind them. Two federal agents placed their hands firmly on Gerald and Evelyn's shoulders. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around their wrists, permanently ending their luxurious stolen retirement. The narrative perspective shifts across the Atlantic landing sharply in the sun-drenched hills overlooking Milan. The morning air was crisp and scented with citrus. Valerie sat on the sprawling terracotta terrace of her luxury villa, draped in a heavy silk robe purchased with the stolen capital of my architectural empire. She lifted a delicate porcelain cup of freshly brewed espresso to her lips, gazing out over the manicured vineyards that sloped down toward the valley. Her new Italian life was a perfect gilded sanctuary, constructed entirely on a foundation of absolute treachery. She set the cup down on the wrought iron table and picked up her encrypted mobile phone. Her brow furrowed in deep, aggressive irritation. It was already mid-morning in Italy, meaning the sun had set hours ago in Atlanta. The 40th anniversary gala should be over. The forced medical transition should be a finalized legal reality. She unlocked the screen and aggressively dialed Naomi's private number. She expected her daughter to answer immediately, breathlessly, confirming that the massive dose of amphetamines had successfully ruptured my cardiovascular system. The call rang once and went directly to an automated voicemail. Valerie cursed sharply under her breath. She slammed the phone onto the table, the impact rattling her porcelain saucer. She had explicitly commanded Naomi to execute the lethal stroke protocol before the gala began. A simple, untraceable chemical spike was all it took to trigger the power of attorney and secure the offshore banking transfers. Valerie despised incompetence. She muttered to herself about how utterly useless her American family had become. She had spent the last 9 years enjoying the flawless execution of her fake maritime death laundering $4 million through Cayman Island shell companies to fund this European paradise. She had flawlessly manipulated her own parents and trained her daughter to treat my life as a disposable asset. Now, on the very eve of their final massive payday, Naomi was suddenly unreachable. Valerie paced the length of the terrace, her silk robe billowing behind her. She calculated the exact logistical variables. If I had survived the night, the offshore accounts Bradley had primed for the final corporate liquidation could be exposed to standard banking audits. She picked up the phone again, preparing to dial Bradley's secondary device to demand a status report. She never got the chance to press the call button. The tranquil Mediterranean morning was violently shattered by the explosive roar of tearing metal. The massive reinforced iron gates at the entrance of her private estate did not just open. They were forcefully rammed off their heavy stone hinges. 2 armored tactical vehicles painted in matte black tore through the courtyard, tearing up the immaculate gravel driveway and crushing the imported rose bushes. Valerie froze her phone, slipping from her fingers and clattering against the terracotta tiles. A dozen heavily armed Interpol agents flooded out of the vehicles before the tires completely stopped moving. They wore dark tactical gear, carrying automatic rifles, and moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They fanned out across the courtyard, instantly securing every perimeter exit. Valerie stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in absolute shock. The porcelain espresso cup was knocked off the table, shattering loudly across the stone floor. The heavy oak doors of the villa flew open. Her new Italian husband rushed out onto the terrace. He was still wearing his pajamas, his face twisted in a mask of genuine panic. He stepped in front of Valerie wildly, waving his arms and screaming at the armed men in rapid, furious Italian. He demanded to know who they were and why they were invading his private home. He firmly believed his wife was a wealthy American widow who had inherited her fortune legally. He had absolutely no idea he was married to a phantom. The lead Interpol agent ignored the screaming husband entirely. He holstered his weapon, stepped onto the terrace, and pulled a thick legal document from his tactical vest. He did not address the husband. He looked directly into Valerie's terrified eyes. He spoke in crisp, heavily accented English. He officially identified her by her true American name, completely stripping away her carefully crafted Italian alias. He raised the international arrest warrant. He announced that she was being detained on federal charges of massive life insurance fraud, international money laundering, and faking her own death to extort $4 million from an American corporation. Valerie's face turned the color of dead ash. The pristine, luxurious illusion she had enjoyed for 9 years evaporated in a single second. 2 Interpol agents flanked her immediately, grabbing her wrists with forceful, uncompromising authority. They twisted her arms behind her back. The cold, heavy steel of international handcuffs ratcheted tightly over her silk sleeves. Valerie lost every ounce of her fabricated European elegance. She began thrashing wildly, screaming in frantic English, demanding to speak to a lawyer and denying everything. She shrieked that there had been a terrible mistake. Her Italian husband stopped yelling. He stood completely paralyzed on the terrace, watching the agents drag his screaming wife toward the armored vehicles. He stared at her as if she were a total stranger. The horrifying reality of the international arrest warrant shattered his entire existence. He realized in real time that his marriage, his wealth, and the mother of his teenage triplets was a calculated criminal lie. The tactical agents forced Valerie into the back of the armored transport. The heavy doors slammed shut instantly, silencing her hysterical protests. The vehicles accelerated out of the ruined courtyard, carrying the architect of my misery toward a federal extradition cell. Thousands of miles away, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in downtown Atlanta was entirely silent. The 300 elite guests had been evacuated. The flashing cameras of the financial press were gone. The room was a hollow shell filled with overturned chairs, abandoned champagne flutes, and the shattered remnants of Bradley's professional coronation. The tactical sweep was finished. The federal agents had hauled my treacherous daughter, her husband, and my blackmailing in-laws into secure transport vehicles. I stood alone in the center of the massive room, surrounded by the physical wreckage of my family's absolute destruction. The heavy silence was a profound, beautiful monument to my reclaimed freedom. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom clicked open. Elliot walked slowly across the polished marble floor. His footsteps echoed clearly in the vast space. He did not carry his encrypted laptop. He stopped 2 feet away from me and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a secure satellite phone and handed it directly to me. He looked at my face and offered a single sharp nod. He confirmed that the tactical extraction in Milan was completely successful. Valerie was in federal custody. The ghost had finally been captured, and the eradication of my enemies was permanently, flawlessly complete. I stepped out of the black town car into the crisp, blinding sunlight of the Atlanta morning. The heavy iron gates of my Buckhead estate stood wide open, but the property no longer felt like a compromised sanctuary. It was a reclaimed fortress. 2 marked police cruisers sat idling on the circular cobblestone driveway, their radios periodically cutting through the quiet suburban air. I had contacted the precinct commander an hour after the federal raid at the Waldorf, presenting the official unchallengeable property deed and a series of emergency restraining orders. The police were exclusively present to ensure the complete and orderly purge of my residence. I walked up the limestone steps and watched a highly efficient professional moving crew systematically dismantle the parasitic occupation of my home. 4 burly men were aggressively hauling Naomi and Bradley's excessively expensive possessions out the front door. I vividly recalled the exact day they had moved those pieces into my home. 7 years ago, under the sickening masquerade of providing daily grief support for a supposedly fragile widowed father, they had aggressively packed away my personal history to make room for their imported Italian leather sofas and massive modern art installations. They had treated my living room as their permanent premature inheritance. The movers did not treat the items with any care today. They ruthlessly dumped the luxurious inventory directly onto the manicured front lawn. The sheer volume of their stolen lifestyle formed a pathetic, glittering mountain of garbage under the morning sun. I stood on the porch feeling a profound architectural satisfaction as the physical weight of their presence was violently extracted from my life. They had spent nearly a decade slowly replacing my existence with their arrogant opulence, attempting to erase me before my heart even stopped beating. Watching their velvet chaise lounges, expensive espresso machines, and racks of designer clothing sink into the damp morning grass was absolute poetry. I directed the foreman to completely strip the east wing of the estate, ordering him to leave absolutely nothing behind but the bare drywall and the original hardwood floors. Every single physical trace of Naomi's fraudulent devotion and Bradley's arrogant entitlement was being permanently ripped from the foundation of my home. While the moving crew aggressively cleared the interior, a specialized security contractor systematically dismantled the front door hardware. I supervised the complete extraction of the old brass locks, replacing them with military-grade biometric deadbolts. Every exterior entrance, every window sensor, and every security camera was permanently severed from the old network and rewired to a closed, encrypted system that only recognized my exact fingerprint. My house was officially impenetrable. The heavy crunch of gravel signaled another arrival. Elliot parked his dark sedan behind the police cruisers and walked up the front steps carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened the folder and presented the finalized banking confirmations. The financial execution was absolute and entirely merciless. At exactly midnight, the moment federal agents secured Bradley in handcuffs on the ballroom floor, I had triggered the digital lockouts we had prepared weeks in advance. Elliot handed me the printed ledgers showing zero balances across the board. Every single joint account Naomi had leveraged to fund her luxurious facade was completely drained and legally frozen. The massive corporate expense accounts Bradley had treated as his personal slush fund to secretly finance his failing overseas startup were permanently terminated. The financial arteries they had tapped into for 9 years were ruthlessly cauterized. Elliot informed me that the moment Naomi was processed into federal holding, an automated system attempted to charge her platinum credit cards for her preliminary legal retention fees. The transaction was instantly, violently declined. Her entire financial reality had been evaporated with a single keystroke. They were entirely stripped of the millions they had stolen and hoarded. The massive pile of designer clothing and expensive artwork sitting on my lawn was the only physical capital they had left in the world, and they were currently sitting in concrete cells entirely unable to access it. I signed the final digital authorization on Elliot's tablet, permanently locking the fortress walls around my reclaimed empire. The parasites were officially cut off from the host. My private cellular phone vibrated sharply in my breast pocket. I pulled the device out and stared at the glowing screen. It was an unknown local number originating from a downtown Atlanta area code. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear without offering a greeting. A frantic, exhausted voice immediately filled the line. The man identified himself as a state-appointed public defender operating out of the federal courthouse. He was calling on behalf of my daughter. The lawyer's tone was incredibly desperate, a sharp contrast to the aggressive arrogance Naomi had displayed for the last decade. He begged me to listen rapidly, explaining the brutal reality of Naomi's current situation. She was trapped in a federal holding facility, completely stripped of her designer clothing and her manufactured dignity. She was surrounded by hardened criminals crying uncontrollably and suffering a severe psychological collapse as the reality of a 20-year sentence set in. She was shivering in a concrete cell, absolutely terrified of the environment she now occupied. Naomi had clearly ordered the lawyer to call me, fully expecting her wealthy father to automatically fix her catastrophic mistakes, just as I had done when she crashed her first car or overdrawn her college accounts. The public defender pleaded with me to post a $200,000 cash bond to secure her immediate release pending trial. He explicitly claimed that Naomi lacked the biological and emotional fortitude to survive even one more night inside a federal detention center. He begged me to remember my paternal instincts, asking me to show a sliver of mercy for my only child, assuring me that she was ready to apologize for whatever misunderstanding had occurred. I stood on the porch of my impenetrable fortress, looking at the massive pile of Naomi's discarded possessions baking in the sun. I listened to the lawyer's frantic, breathless pleading echo through the phone. I absorbed every single detail of her terror, her isolation, and her absolute vulnerability. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not utter a single syllable of comfort, anger, or negotiation. I simply lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting the connection with absolute, terrifying finality. I slid the phone back into my pocket, leaving my daughter entirely abandoned to the ruthless, inescapable consequences of her own treachery. 2 exact weeks had passed since the Waldorf Astoria ballroom became the permanent graveyard of my family's criminal ambition. I walked through the heavily fortified external gates of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The air inside the sprawling facility was thick and heavy, smelling strongly of industrial bleach, polished steel, and stagnant human despair. It was a profound, striking architectural contrast to the gilded hall's velvet drapes and cascading crystal chandeliers Naomi had arrogantly paraded beneath just 14 days ago. I surrendered my personal effects to a towering, heavily armed corrections officer and passed through 3 sequential steel security doors. They locked automatically behind me with a series of sharp, deafening mechanical clangs. I entered the sterile visiting room. It was a bleak, windowless chamber constructed entirely of cinder block and cold concrete, designed specifically to strip away all comfort. I walked to booth number 4 and sat down heavily on the rigid metal stool. Directly in front of me was a thick slab of bulletproof, deeply smudged acrylic glass. I placed my hands flat on the stainless steel counter and waited in absolute silence. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly, the electronic lock disengaging with a harsh snap. A female corrections officer stepped into the frame, gripping the upper arm of a prisoner. It was Naomi. The physical transformation was absolute and brutally thorough. The impeccably manicured, diamond-draped heiress who had kissed my cheek and actively plotted my biological assassination was permanently gone. She had been entirely replaced by a hollow, terrified inmate. She wore a shapeless, heavily faded orange jumpsuit that completely swallowed her shrinking frame. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled, greasy, and entirely stripped of its professional styling. Her skin was incredibly pale, stretched tightly over her cheekbones, highlighting the profound, inescapable reality of her new existence. She shuffled forward with her head bowed, her wrists bound by heavy steel transport chains linked to a thick leather belly chain. The corrections officer forced her into the hard plastic chair opposite me and unlocked the cuffs, instructing her harshly not to touch the glass. Naomi slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, swollen, and darting frantically around the concrete room, as if she expected the walls to physically crush her. She looked at me sitting on the other side of the impenetrable barrier. She saw the immaculate tailoring of my charcoal suit. She saw the absolute unbroken power radiating from my posture. The realization of the insurmountable distance between my freedom and her incarceration hit her with the force of a freight train. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. Her hands shook as she reached forward to grasp the heavy black telephone receiver mounted to the cinder block wall. She lifted the plastic handle to her ear, desperate to bridge the cold, silent gap I had deliberately constructed between us. I picked up my respective receiver and held it to my ear. I did not speak a single word. I simply let the dead, static hum of the prison recording line fill the space between us. Naomi gripped her phone with both hands. She pressed her face close to the thick acrylic glass and immediately broke into violent, heaving sobs. The tears streaming down her face were completely genuine, but they were not born of guilt or remorse. They were born entirely of absolute, suffocating terror. She begged me to forgive her. Her voice cracked and pitched hysterically as she rapidly flooded the line with desperate manufactured excuses. She swore to me that the entire assassination plot was never her original idea. She frantically pointed the finger at her disgraced husband, claiming Bradley had relentlessly brainwashed her over the last 5 years. She insisted his massive offshore debts had driven him completely insane, forcing her to comply with his corporate embezzlement just to save their marriage. When she saw my expression remain entirely unmoved, she rapidly shifted her deceitful tactics. She weaponized Valerie's ghost once again, but this time as a defensive shield. Naomi shrieked through the receiver that her mother had contacted her from Italy months ago, threatening to expose her own financial crimes unless Naomi actively accelerated my death. She painted herself as a helpless, frightened victim caught in the crossfire of Bradley's blinding ambition and Valerie's monstrous blackmail. She pressed her hand flat against the bulletproof glass, leaving a greasy, panicked smudge on the barrier. She pleaded with me to remember the innocent little girl I had raised. She begged me to deploy my vast wealth to save her from the horrific reality of the federal holding facility. Naomi rapidly detailed the absolute brutality of her cell block, weeping endlessly about the daily physical threats, the terrible food, and the terrifying isolation. She demanded that I hire the most expensive elite criminal defense team in the country to secure her immediate release. She promised she would spend the rest of her life making amends, eagerly, offering to testify against Bradley, Valerie, Gerald, and Evelyn in federal court. She offered me absolute loyalty, completely oblivious to the fact that her loyalty had a highly documented, extremely lethal price tag. She exhausted her lungs, gasping for air, as her frantic monologue finally ran dry, waiting for me to play the role of the devoted rescuing father one last time. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the pathetic echo of her frantic desperation. My face was carved from solid granite. I did not blink. I stared directly through her swollen, terrified eyes and pierced the dark, hollow void where her conscience should have been. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripped of all paternal affection, anger, or vengeance. I spoke with the chilling mechanical precision of a structural engineer condemning a faulty building. I informed Naomi that I had visited my legal team the exact morning of the anniversary gala hours before she planted the lethal amphetamines in my private bathroom. I stated clearly that I had officially legally disowned her. I had her name completely eradicated from my will, my trusts, and my corporate succession plans. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as the full weight of my words registered in her brain. I did not stop there. I completely dismantled her final desperate hope of a financial rescue. I revealed that the massive, multi-million-dollar fortune she had attempted to murder me for no longer existed in my private accounts. I had systematically liquidated the vast majority of my personal assets immediately following the federal raid. I proudly informed my daughter that I had taken the exact millions she so desperately coveted and donated every single cent to a highly respected, heavily audited charity dedicated exclusively to building affordable housing for displaced and abused seniors. The money she killed for was currently funding the exact demographic she had brutally attempted to exploit. Naomi's breath hitched violently in her throat. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She realized simultaneously that she was completely bankrupt, entirely disowned, and permanently trapped behind federal concrete. She opened her mouth, a shrill, guttural scream tearing from her vocal cords. Before the agonizing sound could fully transmit through the telephone wire, I calmly pulled the receiver away from my ear. I reached out and placed the heavy black plastic firmly onto its metal cradle. The sharp mechanical click instantly severed the connection, plunging my side of the glass into absolute, beautiful silence. Naomi slammed her fists repeatedly against the bulletproof acrylic, shrieking soundlessly as the corrections officer moved in quickly to physically restrain her. I stood up from the metal stool, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored jacket, and turned my back on the stranger screaming in the orange jumpsuit. I walked purposefully toward the heavy steel exit doors, leaving the absolute destruction of my past securely locked behind me. I left the oppressive, bleach-soaked air of the federal penitentiary behind me, stepping out into the blinding, crisp sunlight of the Atlanta morning. The drive back to the city center was a smooth, uninterrupted glide. I pulled my car into the secured underground garage of my architectural firm. The corporate headquarters of my empire gleamed under the morning sun, a towering structural monument of glass and steel. I walked through the revolving doors of the main lobby, instantly registering the profound atmospheric shift. The subtle, toxic hum of Bradley's impending regime had been surgically excised from the building. Junior architects, senior structural engineers, and department heads stood up respectfully as I passed their glass-walled offices. They did not look at me with the manufactured pity or the predatory anticipation that had plagued the weeks leading up to the gala. They looked at me with profound, unadulterated awe. I had not just survived a hostile corporate takeover. I had ruthlessly obliterated the usurpers on a highly public stage. I walked the length of the executive corridor with the steady, measured stride of a reigning titan. Bradley's temporary transition office had been completely gutted. The maintenance crew had stripped the frosted vinyl lettering from his door and hauled his custom-ordered desk out of the building. I reached the heavy oak doors of the CEO suite and stepped inside. The space was immaculate. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp lines across my drafting table and illuminating the scale models of future skyscrapers. There were no parasitic demands waiting on my desk. There were no forged documents demanding my signature. The heavy metallic tension of hidden knives and whispered conspiracies was entirely gone. I walked over to the leather executive chair and sat down. The silence in the office was rich and absolute. For the first time in 9 years, I was completely alone at the apex of my empire, and the isolation was not a burden. It was the purest form of security. I spent the morning reviewing the upcoming quarter's blueprints, my mind operating with the razor-sharp clarity the medical board had certified. The firm was no longer a hijacked vessel drifting toward a catastrophic iceberg. It was a fully armed dreadnought, completely under my command. The heavy oak door of my office opened with a quiet, deliberate click. Elliot stepped into the suite carrying a slim, reinforced leather portfolio under his arm. He walked directly to my desk and placed the finalized legal ledger onto the polished wood. We did not exchange meaningless pleasantries or engage in small talk. He opened the binder and presented the absolute culmination of our counteroffensive. The financial fortress was officially impenetrable. The blind trust was permanently sealed, locking the remainder of my liquidated assets away from any potential future litigation or fraudulent claims. My wealth was a ghost entirely untouchable by human hands. Elliot turned the page to the criminal indictments. He delivered the international update first with grim satisfaction. Valerie was currently rotting inside a damp, maximum security holding cell in Milan. The Italian authorities, disgusted by the sheer magnitude of her deception, had denied all requests for bail. Her luxurious Mediterranean villa had been seized by Interpol. Her extradition treaty was fully processed, and armed federal marshals were already in the air to drag her back to American soil. She would face the absolute maximum penalty for international wire fraud and faking her own death. Elliot then flipped to the domestic report. Bradley, Naomi, Gerald, and Evelyn had all been denied bond by a federal judge who viewed them as extreme flight risks. They were locked in separate high-security penitentiaries, completely isolated from one another to prevent further collusion. The federal prosecutor had stacked the charges so incredibly high that they were mathematically guaranteed to spend the next 3 decades behind bars. There would be no plea deals offered. There would be no leniency granted. Gerald and Evelyn would spend their final days in a sterile prison medical ward rather than the lavish Buckhead estate they had planned to steal. They had all attempted to execute me for my wealth, and in return I had orchestrated their permanent, devastating removal from society. I picked up my pen and signed the final page of the legal binder. The slate was wiped entirely clean. Elliot closed the portfolio, gave me a single respectful nod, and quietly exited the office. I left the firm as the evening shadows began to stretch aggressively across the downtown skyline. I drove my car through the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead, turning into the long, manicured driveway of my estate. The massive iron gates locked securely behind me with a heavy, satisfying mechanical slam. The mansion stood in immaculate silence. The chaotic, violating presence of my daughter and her treacherous husband had been scrubbed from every single room. I walked into the main study and moved directly toward the crystal decanter resting on the mahogany side table. I poured a heavy measure of aged Kentucky bourbon into a heavy glass. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the fading light. I walked through the French doors and stepped out onto the expansive stone patio. The evening air was cool and clean. The sky was burning with a brilliant bruised orange and deep violet sunset. I stood at the edge of the terrace looking out over the perfectly manicured grounds. The profound, agonizing pain of a 40-year betrayal should have broken my foundation. The realization that my wife, my daughter, my son-in-law, and my extended family all wanted me dead should have left me a bitter, hollowed-out shell of a man. Instead, the intense psychological torture had been entirely burned away by the cold, absolute satisfaction of flawless justice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, feeling the familiar harsh burn slide down my throat. I listened to the quiet that surrounded me. It was absolute. It was no longer the suffocating, heavy silence of a man waiting for the assassin's blade to strike in the dark. It was the definitive, unbreakable sound of total victory. I had built a massive legacy, survived its attempted demolition, and buried the traitors under the sheer weight of their own blinding greed. I raised my glass to the fading light, a master architect completely at peace in the impenetrable fortress he had reclaimed. As a master architect, my entire professional existence has been rigidly governed by the unforgiving laws of physics and the absolute necessity of a flawless structural foundation. You cannot construct a 90-story skyscraper on a shifting bed of sand, and you absolutely cannot build a lasting, meaningful legacy on a hollow foundation of lies. For 40 years, I actively ignored the fundamental structural flaws within my own home. I overlooked the microscopic fractures in my marriage to Valerie. I turned a blind eye to the deep, pervasive rot of entitlement consuming my daughter Naomi. I mistakenly believed my relentless financial provision would act as the steel rebar holding my fragile family together. I was entirely wrong. Money does not reinforce character. It merely amplifies the existing architecture of the soul. If the human soul is completely hollow, sudden wealth simply fills the void with profound, consuming greed. The ultimate lesson I extracted from this agonizing, decade-long betrayal is that proximity does not equal loyalty, and blood certainly does not guarantee love. Society actively conditions us to believe family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are taught to quietly endure disrespect, manipulation, and severe psychological abuse simply because the perpetrators share our genetic code or our legal last name. This is a highly dangerous, potentially lethal fallacy. Predators do not check their predatory instincts at the front door just because they are biologically related to you. In fact, the absolute most dangerous adversaries you will ever face are often the ones sitting directly across from you at the dinner table. They possess the exact blueprints to your deepest emotional vulnerabilities. They know precisely which psychological support beams to strike to bring your entire existence crashing down. My treacherous family did not attack me with physical weapons. They weaponized my love. They weaponized my agonizing grief over Valerie's highly fabricated death. They weaponized my advancing age, attempting to maliciously twist the natural progression of time into a fraudulent diagnosis of severe cognitive decline. They executed a campaign of extreme elder financial abuse with terrifying surgical precision. Elder abuse rarely begins with a loud, aggressive threat. It almost always begins with soft, patronizing concern. It begins with a daughter gently suggesting you are too tired to manage your own bank accounts. It begins with a son-in-law quietly isolating you from your longtime trusted legal advisors. The descent into victimization is slow, quiet, and incredibly insidious. You must remain permanently, ruthlessly vigilant. I learned the hard way that absolute silence is the most devastating weapon in any strategic arsenal. When you discover you are surrounded by domestic traitors, your initial primitive instinct is to scream. You desperately want to confront them. You want to demand explanations and shout about the staggering injustice of their profound betrayal. Giving in to that emotional outburst is a fatal tactical error. Anger is loud, but it is ultimately entirely weak. Anger alerts your enemies to your exact position. It shows them exactly where you are and exactly how much they have managed to hurt you. Silence, however, is completely impenetrable. Silence generates absolute terror in the cold hearts of the guilty. While Bradley, Naomi, Harold, and Evelyn frantically dug their own graves with their chaotic, noisy greed, I operated in the complete vacuum of total silence. I gathered irrefutable physical evidence. I secured my massive financial fortresses. I quietly aligned my legal and tactical allies. I did not give my executioners a single warning before I dropped the federal hammer directly onto their heads. You must never negotiate with parasites. Furthermore, I discovered the profound, unyielding difference between being a victim and being a survivor. A victim allows the trauma to define the remainder of their existence. A survivor actively weaponizes the trauma to forge an entirely new reality. My family desperately wanted me to simply fade away into a sterile, locked nursing home completely stripped of my dignity, my agency, and my massive empire. They wanted to erase my lifelong legacy and replace it with their own unearned luxury. I vehemently refused to grant them that victory. Hitting the absolute rock bottom of human betrayal did not break my spirit. It completely liberated me. Once you fully realize that the people you were desperately trying to protect are actually the ones holding the knife, you are instantly freed from all moral obligations to them. You no longer owe them your precious time, your vast resources, or your mercy. Today, my immense wealth serves an entirely new, deeply powerful purpose. I violently redirected the entire flow of my capital. The exact millions of dollars Naomi and Bradley attempted to embezzle are now permanently locked within an impenetrable charitable trust. I established a massive, heavily funded organization specifically designed to aggressively combat elder financial exploitation. We provide elite legal representation, aggressive private investigative services, and secure emergency housing for vulnerable seniors who are actively being targeted by their own greedy families. The fortune my daughter believed was her absolute birthright is currently funding the complete legal destruction of predators exactly like her. Every single time my foundation successfully prosecutes an abusive family member, it stands as a direct, permanent monument to my definitive victory over Naomi's treachery. You are never too old to fiercely defend your empire. You are never too old to completely rewrite the final chapters of your existence. Modern society often expects the elderly to quietly accept their marginalization, to eagerly surrender their autonomy for the sake of avoiding familial conflict. I reject that cowardly expectation entirely. Human dignity does not possess an expiration date. If your family treats you as a disposable financial asset, you must possess the supreme courage to treat them as a toxic liability. You must find the internal strength to cut the deep infection out of your life regardless of how deeply it has taken root. Authentic healing is completely impossible as long as the parasite remains firmly attached to the host. My sweeping mansion is perfectly quiet now, but it is the resonant quiet of absolute peace, not heavy isolation. I sit on my stone terrace every single evening, watching the brilliant sunset over the city skyline that my hands helped construct. I know Valerie is currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell in Milan, actively awaiting federal extradition to the United States. I know Bradley and Naomi are permanently locked inside separate maximum security federal penitentiaries, facing 3 decades of hard time. I know Gerald and Evelyn are experiencing the agonizing, terrifying reality of a federal prison medical ward. They aggressively gambled their entire freedom on the false, arrogant assumption that my advancing age directly equated to cognitive weakness. They lost absolutely everything. I securely retained my entire empire, my sharp intellect, and my absolute unyielding freedom. The ultimate revenge is not simply punishing your enemies. It is thriving magnificently in the exact space they desperately tried to bury you. Leave a comment below detailing your personal strategies and thoughts on handling a betrayal of this massive magnitude by your own family. If this story resonated with you, please ensure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more intense, high-stakes narratives of survival and retribution. Share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder to always protect their boundaries and fiercely defend their legacy. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next story.